Test, 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 test. Okay. Okay, that. Okay, increase the gain on the mic. So hopefully that helps. If not, we'll get a Bluetooth secondary mic. Okay, let's see. Hi, everybody. Time for part 2 of the endocrine system. And so again, this is not going to be on the exam, but thank you for coming today. I know you're probably stressed out about the exam, but this will probably pay dividends. Attending today pays dividends on exam 4 for sure. And I'm just gonna throw this one. I updated the slide a little bit just recently, so you can add to them, or you can go download them again if you're looking at it. Just throwing this this particular sort of chart up here, or this table up here, because this is sort of like the best overall summary table, right, of what you're gonna sort of need to know. And so now we're gonna sort of walk through more of these endocrine hormones and what is the actual anatomy of that? And again, what is the origin? What is the target? What is the function of the hormone? What happens when things go wrong? How could things go wrong? What are the resulting diseases that can occur from that? And sort of take a little review here of the overall anatomy of the signaling systems that are involved in releasing hormones from the posterior and anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so this is like the master gland endocrine system right here. Okay, posterior pituitary and anterior pituitary have released many different hormones, and depending on whether you're in the posterior pituitary, which is an outgrowth of the brain itself, so it has a direct connection to the brain, or if you're in the anterior pituitary, which is actually originates in an outpocketing of the roof of the mouth, there you don't have a direct connection to the brain, but you do have a very close connection via these portal vessels, a sort of capillary network that is specifically designed to pass hormones, releasing hormones or regulating hormones from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so, but let's look at some of these other structures here. What's on this sort of map? This is the brain, right? So the brain is intimately involved in the regulation and release of hormones, right? Because we want, a lot of these hormones are being released in order to coordinate responses, long-term responses to changes in our environment, changes in our situation. And so we want to gain information about the outside world in order to influence the release of those hormones. So we've got the cerebrum or the cerebral cortex. This is where, all of your thinking really occurs, all your sort of, cognitive capacity where you're thinking about, languages coming from there, sensory integration, motor planning. A lot of your sort of conscious thoughts are occurring within the cerebrum. Cerebellum is involved in sort of coordinating motor control. Thalamus is going to be a little relay that takes information from your peripheral senses and sort of shuttles it into the cerebrum. And then we're looking, and then the spinal cord is going to be a way at which the brain sort of sends out messages to the rest of the body, to the peripheral nervous system, and to the adrenal cortex, or sorry, to the adrenal gland, particularly the medulla of the adrenal gland is going to get information, electrical signals directly from the brain via the spinal cord. Okay, so those are like sort of supportive structures. They aren't really the endocrine system, but they are going to provide input to the endocrine system so that the endocrine system can release hormones appropriately. Now, we've got a few other things here. We've got the pineal gland. Okay, I think this is pineal gland should actually, that should be pointing right here. I don't know why it's pointing right there, but the little, the little color thing. The pineal gland was Descartes thought that it was where the soul resided, but he was wrong, I think. Actually, it's just where the melatonin resides. So the pineal gland is there. It's going to control one aspect of hormone release, and then pituitary gland really has a ton of different functions, a ton of different hormones associated with it. Okay, so sorry, let me move this cursor around. All right, so we've got the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, that is going to store and release hormones, two hormones in particular that are made within the hypothalamus, and then neurons within the hypothalamus actually extend down into the posterior pituitary gland. It's a continuous part of the brain, okay? And those hormones are going to be stored and released in the posterior pituitary from cell bodies that are up in the hypothalamus. On the other hand, in the anterior pituitary gland, okay, those are going to be controlled by hormones released from the hypothalamus and then act on the anterior, different cell types within the anterior pituitary. Okay, and how does that sort of process work, right? So if we have a neurosecretory cell here in the hypothalamus, it is going to sort of produce one of these hormones. It's going to come down an axon. It's going to release into blood vessels, and then those hormones will travel through the body, okay, and then land on receptors and drive a response. In the case of this anterior pituitary, there's going to be a very short path between the hypothalamus and a very specialized path between hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. So let's look at the posterior pituitary hormones. There's two of them, only two that you need to know, which is great. Pretty simple. I think there's only two hormones made there, actually. Well, I guess they're made in the hypothalamus, but only two hormones are released from the posterior pituitary. What are they? Okay, well, we've got oxytocin and ADH, also known as arginine vasopressin. Okay, so ADH or arginine vasopressin, we've already covered it, right? It's in the kidney. What does it do again? This is actually going to be on exam 3. It increases the water permeability of the proximal and cortical collecting tubules. It's going to increase urea absorption, sodium reabsorption in the ascending limb, and it is going to regulate the overall level of osmolarity of the blood, right? Now, on the other hand, we've got oxytocin. We've talked about that a little bit last time, okay? So oxytocin is involved in driving uterine contractions, leading to initiation of labor and delivery of a baby, okay? It also drives the milk letdown reflex. So it's involved in these sort of positive feedback loops that are associated generally with sexual reproduction and delivery. It also is in charge of the post-ejaculatory refractory period. where a man cannot ejaculate a second time within a narrow window of time. And that is basically causes this relaxation to take place. It cannot happen. It also is intimately involved in the formation of pair bonding between mammals. And this was shown in prairie voles. If you sort of inject oxytocin or release oxytocin in two sets of prairie voles, they will form pair bonding due to the action of oxytocin. If you block oxytocin receptors, they'll no longer be able to form pair bonds, won't be monogamous. There's the research on that's a little bit sketchy, but yeah.
Just talking about ADH, does it affect the permeability of the proximal cortical and collecting duct?
Right. So collecting duct is, so we've mostly talked about the collecting duct though. So the prime, think about it primarily as affecting aquaporin on the collecting duct. Okay. Yes. There also has some influence on the proximal tubule, but for the purposes of the exam, at least, let's just think about it as focused on the collecting duct. Okay. So these hormones are synthesized here, right? They're going to travel down what are known as axons, these very thin sort of passageways, so continuous outgrowths of the neuron, and then they will release directly into the bloodstream from the posterior pituitary structure itself. Okay, so nerve impulses, electrical signals will propagate. So basically, they're synthesizing it here. Okay, it travels down here, gets stored in synaptic vesicles here, and then an electrical signal will come down from the hypothalamus to here that causes release, fusion of those synaptic vesicles, release of the neurohormone into the bloodstream. We're going to talk all about that sort of process in the nervous system component. Now, that's the posterior pituitary. That's the easy one. Okay. Oh no. Oh my God. Oh. This way I should put this down here. Hopefully nothing breaks down there. Let's talk about the anterior pituitary. Okay, anterior pituitary has a ton of hormones associated with it. Okay, all of these are important, and we're going to talk about them to different levels today. Most of what we're going to handle on the sort of sex hormones, we'll talk about during sexual reproduction next week. Okay, so this is the overall structure of the anterior pituitary gland. We have neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus. Okay, there's going to be distinct classes of neurosecretory cells that are going to all make different, that are sort of found in different nuclei of the hypothalamus. Each nucleus of the hypothalamus is a collection of cells that get specific types of sensory input, okay, and control one particular aspect of behavior. Are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Do you have a drive to mate? Do you have a drive to fight? All of those things are controlled by very specific clusters of neurons within the hypothalamus, okay? And each one of them is going to release distinct hormones that are going to act not on the whole body necessarily, right away, but act on specific cell types within the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so these are going to be hypothalamic releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. So for each one of these hormones here that we're seeing, okay, these ones in red, orange, whatever, these are produced by specialized cells within the anterior pituitary, but the release of those is in turn controlled by release of different hormones that are specific to that hormone up here, okay, from the hypothalamus. Okay, so now we want to make some distinctions here, and there's a specific terminology that I want you to know, okay? Tropic hormones, these are hormones that are going to be released that are going to act on other endocrine glands, okay? So things like these releasing hormones are going to be tropic hormones because they're acting on this gland, okay, to then cause the release of another hormone. Or you could release a tropic hormone that's going to act on the gonads, for example, and that will cause the production of testosterone, for example. That will be a tropic hormone, okay? We also have non-trophic effects of hormones that are going to directly act on cells that are not part of an endocrine gland, okay? So things like that might be prolactin, okay, which is what regulates milk production, promotes milk production. So they'll act on breast tissue, okay, and that is not a endocrine gland. It's sort of a final target, right? So that would be a non-tropic effect. Another example of that would be melanocyte stimulating hormone, which is going to upregulate the activity of melanocytes within the skin and cause darkening of the skin. Okay. So I want to contrast the tropic from trophic. Okay, if we add an H there, making the F sound, right? A trophic hormone is something that is actually just related to the growth of body tissues. Okay, so anything that is trophic has trophic effects, is sort of increasing the activity or the growth of a body tissue or the activity of a particular cell type. Okay, so a lot of hormones here. Let's sort of give a brief overview of each one. Okay, so follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. This is always sort of coupled to LH, luteinizing hormone. And these are hormones, oh God. Out of batteries. Okay, these are hormones that are going to regulate sex hormones and the control of the menstrual cycle, okay, development okay, so in the case of follicle stimulating hormone, they are going to basically promote the maturation of primordial germ cells. So those are the cells that are going to be able to make new humans, right? They have primordial, so germ cell is a cell that has, so it's either a sperm or an egg that has half of the complement of genes that you need in order to create an embryo. Okay? And we need to, of course, mature those cells over some period of development. So the follicle stimulating hormone is going to target what's known as Sertoli cells within the testes of men, or in females, it's going to target the follicle, which is the material that surrounds each egg. Okay, and it's a set of cells around that surrounds each egg that can then develop and proliferate during the course of ovarian cycles. Okay. So FSH is going to do that. Luteinizing hormone is going to do two different things depending on the male or female sex organs. In males, it's going to stimulate Leydig cells, which are also part of the testes, to produce testosterone, which is sort of a masculine, creates male sex characteristics. And then in females, a surge of luteinizing hormone is going to trigger ovulation. It's going to cause a mature follicle that contains an egg to rupture and release the egg into the oviduct and so on and so forth. It also, following that release, the follicle of the set of cells that was sort of nourishing the development of that egg does not immediately degrade. It turns into something called the corpus luteum, or the yellow body. Okay, so luteum is sort of means yellow. Okay, and that is going to produce other sorts of sex hormones that will sort of promote early pregnancy and the maintenance of the uterine lining for a week or two following the release of the egg. Okay, so that's FSH and LH. That's all we're going to talk about on FSH and LH in this lecture, but we will go into it in greater detail next week. Then we've got thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, so this is a tropic hormone. Okay, so it is going to target another endocrine organ, okay, or endocrine gland. Okay, in this case, it's going to target, rather than the testes. So FSH and LH target the gonads, testes, and ovaries. TSH is going to target the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is going to produce thyroid hormone. Okay, thyroid hormone then is released into the bloodstream and increases the metabolism of pretty much every cell in your body that has a metabolism to control. Okay, then we have adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay, so this is released from anterior pituitary and targets the adrenal cortex. Okay, so this is the outside surface of the adrenal gland, and there it is going to cause the release of cortisol, which is really a response to stress. Okay, so cortisol increases blood sugar by a variety of mechanisms. The gluconeogenesis, that's remember the production of glucose from fat or proteins. going to suppress the immune system. It's going to metabolize fat. It's going to decrease the ossification of the bones, the collection of calcium onto the bone, and the growth of the bone. So this is like a hormone that responds to stress. And you can imagine, so how do we even measure stress, right? It could be overall levels of cortisol, but this is controlled, okay, by some sort of signal, right? That the release of this is controlled by a releasing hormone that is created in the hypothalamus. Okay. And the hypothalamus can integrate all sorts of information about your life, right? It has inputs from your sensory systems. It knows that a test is coming, so it knows that your stress levels might be high, and it can say, okay, increase the level of ACTH, which will then increase the level of cortisol and drive a stress response. Okay, so then we have prolactin. Okay, prolactin has the non-tropic effects. It's affecting the mammary glands, which we just talked about, melanocytes, non-tropic effects. And then we have finally growth hormone, okay, or human growth hormone, and sometimes is what you might have heard it as. And growth hormone is going to have both trophic and tropic and non-tropic effects. And it is a trophic hormone because it is impacting the growth and activity of tissues, right? So this is going to target a wide variety of structures, okay? Both the liver, it's going to cause the liver to produce insulin-like growth factors, which are going to then increase sort of growth of the body, lengthening of bones, if the bones are able to be lengthened, if you're at the appropriate point in development. And it's going to increase cell reproduction and regeneration. This is why human growth hormone often taken as a sort of generally banned, I think, but as sort of a stimulant or for recovery in athletic competition, high level athletic competition. A lot of people are taking human growth hormone in order to recover from injuries or from training. So each one of these hormones, okay, is, as I said, controlled by releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus. And each one of them also has a specific cell type, okay, within here. Okay, so we have gonadotropes, okay, something that is going to act on the gonads. So gonadotropes are cells that are specialized for production of FSH and LH that respond to sex hormone releasing hormone, okay? And they're called gonadotropes. Then we have thyrotropes. So these are cells within the anterior pituitary that produce TSH. Then we have corticotropes. These are cells within the anterior pituitary that produce ACTH. We have lactotropes that release prolactin. And then we have somatotropes, which release GH. Okay, so somatotropes are going to be under control of somatotropin, which is a hormone that's released by this, that's going to promote the release of GH, as well as somatostatin, which is produced by distinct cells within the hypothalamus, which is going to inhibit the release of GH. So somatotropin sort of increases activity. Somatostatin tries to keep things the same, stasis, right? So keeping the body the same, somatostatin. Okay, so I mean, there's a whole bunch of information here just on this chart. And so I would also say when you're studying, also sort of refer back to this to see, what is the sort of summary of all the different sort of things that are being produced in these areas. Okay. Okay. So let's dig in a little bit more on some of these hormones. So we've got the thyroid gland. Okay, so the thyroid gland is like this butterfly-shaped gland that wraps around your larynx right here. Okay, it's pretty big, and it's a gland that's highly responsive to thyroid-stimulating hormone. Okay? It can grow or shrink based on the amount of TSH that's in the blood. Okay, and how does it get activated? Well, it's actually through a cascade of effects. Okay, so the hypothalamus has something called thyrotropin releasing hormone, right? It's going to release this into this portal vessel here, okay, which is a little capillary network called a neural hypophysis. And that is going to travel down here into, very rapidly will move down into the adrenal gland, sorry, not the adrenal gland, the anterior pituitary gland, and then drive the release of thyroid stimulating hormone from the thyroid circulation. That thyroid stimulating hormone then it gets released into the general circulation and then lands on thyroid gland, which is going to upregulate the production of thyroid hormone there. Okay, so why do we have this little portal vessel here? It's so like the hormones that are released from the hypothalamus here, these releasing hormones, these control hormones, don't get diluted sort of throughout the entire bloodstream before they hit their targets. In fact, it'll only take it'll take less than a second for hormones released here, and they'll stay at a high concentration because they're just going to pass over here quickly to the adrenal, to the anterior pituitary gland, which is going to then cause a relatively rapid response, quick feedback from hypothalamus to anterior pituitary. Okay, so I'm going to mention a second structure here because anatomically it's right next to it. It's actually embedded with it, which is the parathyroid glands. Okay, the parathyroid glands are these little glands that are sort of stuck, these sort of four little nodes embedded within the thyroid. They don't do anything to do with thyroid production. Okay, these parathyroid glands do not impact thyroid production. They're not stimulated by TSH. They do something totally different, which is regulate blood calcium levels by a parathyroid hormone. Just mentioning that here. Okay, so they are going to increase blood calcium levels by causing the breakdown of calcium from bones. Okay, so we talked about, we mentioned like this thyroid hormone is really and is under control of this cascade of hormones. Okay. We've got some sort of stimulus. Maybe the stimulus is the level of thyroid hormones in our body that are circulating around. That's going to trigger sensory neurons are going to detect that and then send information, electrical signals to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is going to release thyrotropin, thyrotropin releasing hormone. Okay, thyrotropin releasing hormone is going to target the thyrotropins, okay, in our anterior pituitary gland. So this releasing hormone gets released over to the anterior pituitary. That's going to then cause the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone. That's going to circulate through the whole body. It's going to hit the thyroid gland, activate thyroid stimulating hormone receptors on the thyroid gland. They are going to create thyroid hormone, which is comes in two flavors, T3 and T4. That's going to circulate throughout the body, and that's going to drive a response. What is it going to do? It's going to bind to transporters on the surface of many cells. Okay, we've got taken up into cells. It's going to turn into, this is one of these hydrophobic molecules, hydrophobic hormones. So it's going to come in, or lipophilic. It's going to come into the cell, diffuse through the cell, and bind to specific thyroid hormone receptors. Coupled to that, translocate to the nucleus and act as a transcription factor that turns on or off a large variety of genes associated with metabolism. It's going to basically increase metabolism, increase metabolism and increase the overall amount of energy production within the body. Okay, now, this is a long cascade, right? And we are going to want to have some sort of negative regulation, negative feedback to make sure thyroid hormones don't get too high. We don't burn ourselves up, so to speak. Okay, so thyroid hormone is going to feedback at multiple locations on this pathway. Okay, and provide negative feedback directly to the hypothalamus to reduce the amount of thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, and also have negative feedback on the anterior pituitary itself to reduce the release of TSH. Okay, so multiple spots of negative feedback and also multiple locations where the signaling cascade could go wrong, right? And due to the sort of complexity of this cascade, we can diagnose how things are going wrong, how a particular disease is being manifest via blood tests for levels of TRH, of TSH, and for T3, T4. So that way we'll be able to dissect where within this sequence of events there is a dysregulation, and thus be able to effectively target an intervention, a medical intervention for that. So what are the two most, yeah, go ahead.
Are T3 and T4 two different types of thyroid?
Mhm.
It's important to understand the distinction.
Yep, and I will show you, I got some slides on that in a little bit. So yes, T3 and T4 are two different types of thyroid hormone. They both are, well, I'll go into it in a little bit. Okay, before we go into that though, let's look at some disorders, okay? So you can, I mean, the two basic classes, you could divide these disorders into two major classes: hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism. That means too much thyroid activity and too little thyroid activity. Okay, so and we can think logically through this, right? What would hyperthyroidism do? Okay, if we have too much metabolic activity, what'll happen is, you know, our mitochondria are going too much. Our body temperature is going to be higher. We're going to tend to be sweating. We're going to be using up. We're going to be burning calories faster due to our cellular metabolism being high. That'll tend to lead to weight loss, tend to increase our blood pressure. Okay. On the other hand, hypothyroidism is commonly associated with weight gain. We're not burning enough calories. We're not using the energy stores within our body to produce energy. Okay, you're going to feel sort of exhausted, slow. You don't want to do anything. You'll have intolerance to cold levels. Okay, so these two things are sort of counteracting one another or opposite of one another. So how can we? What are the common sort of drivers of these disorders? One of them is Graves' disease. So a common sort of form of hyperthyroidism is Graves' disease. This is caused by the immune system inappropriately creating some immunoglobulins that bind to thyroid stimulating hormone receptors in the thyroid gland. Okay, so imagine you have an immunoglobulin, like an antibody, right? That binds onto a receptor. For whatever reason, your B cell didn't get screened out appropriately. Now you're making this thyroid globulin or immunoglobulins binding onto the receptor, and it locks the thyroid stimulating hormone receptor into a constitutively active configuration. Okay, so that means it's always on, and it's bound there almost like permanently. Okay, so now regardless of whether or not you have thyroid stimulating hormone around or not, that receptor for that thyroid stimulating hormone is turned on. That's going to cause the thyroid gland to be overactive. Okay, it's going to keep churning out thyroid hormone, T3 and T4. Okay, and that T3 and T4 level is going to go up, right? So we'll see increase in T3, T4 levels. So we're turning this thyroid gland on like crazy. Okay, this is going to increase our T3, T4 levels. What will happen? It's going to provide negative feedback to the hypothalamus. It's going to provide negative feedback to the anterior pituitary. It's going to say, turn off production of TRH, turn off production of TSH. Okay, because we've got too much thyroid hormone circulating. But it's still not going to stop the actual production of the thyroid hormone because this immunoglobulin is binding to the receptor. So what would we expect the blood levels, the blood serum levels of these different hormones to be? We'd expect really high levels of thyroid hormone, and we'd expect actually very low levels of TRH and TSH because they're under the negative feedback of this thyroid hormone. So that would be the way that you can test for Graves' disease. High thyroid levels, low thyroid releasing, thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay. On the other end, one of the sort of at the extreme level, right? So these are sort of sort of generalized symptoms of hyperthyroidism, but you can also get growth of particular tissues, vascularization of capillary networks behind the eye that can cause protrusion of the eyes, like this actor, sort of classic actor that was in a bunch of movies before I was born, like, I don't know, the Hunchback of Notre Dame and whatnot. Okay, this is called Graves' ophthalma. I can't say it. Anyway, not a doctor. Ophthalmopathy. Okay, there we go. So just the bulging of the eyes outward. That's another hallmark of Graves' disease and the extreme form of it. Okay. What about hypothyroidism? Okay, so we've got something else. So Hashimoto's disease. Okay. Hashimoto's disease, we have other sorts of autoantibodies that are being produced here that are going to lead not to the binding to the receptor that the thyroid stimulating receptor on the thyroid gland, but actually the targeting of thyroid tissues for destruction by these antibodies, or to block the actual function of those receptors. Okay, in that case, what's going to happen? Our thyroid levels are going to fall. Thyroid hormone levels will fall. We'll release negative feedback here. Okay, so we'll tend to have high levels of TRH, high levels of TSH in the blood, but that is not going to be able to effectively drive the thyroid gland production, because the thyroid gland is either being sort of targeted for destruction by the immune system, or the receptors are blocked, are bound in a configuration that prevents them from being activated by the circulating TSH. Okay, so there's things to think about sort of logically, how might those blood levels be, how might we test for these things based on this sort of feedback loop, or these sort of paired feedback loops. Okay. So let's now look a little bit more detail. What is thyroid hormone exactly anyway? Okay, so we've got, it's kind of a weird structure here. Okay. We have triiodothyronine, also known as T3. It's three of them, triiodo, so 3 iodines. Okay. And we have thyroxine, T4, okay, with 4 iodine atoms. So basically this is the covalently linked tyrosines, okay, pair of them. And they either have 3 or 4 iodines attached to them. These structures, as well as the iodines, are going to make this highly hydrophobic. Okay. Why do we call it triiodothyronine? And thyroxine was discovered first. Okay. It's actually, and that's why it got its special name, thyroxine. And then triiodothyronine was discovered later. Okay. But it turns out that actually T3 is much more active than T4. Okay. They both are going to get released into the blood, but when they're taken up into the target tissues, there are deiodinases, so enzymes that cut off some of these iodines, and the conversion from T4 to a T3 form makes it into a much more effective transcription factor, and will have a bigger, like 10 times bigger impact on sort of gene expression. Okay, so what is the actual process by which this, yeah, it's a little bit complicated, but it's pretty, look, it's like pretty pictures, right? Okay, so let's look and see, how does it actually take place, okay? In order to iodinate something, right, to attach an iodine onto a molecule, we've got to have iodine around, okay? So where are we going to get it? We have to eat it from, we don't make iodine. This is an element, right? We cannot synthesize an element. We have to acquire the element from our environment. Okay, so we eat it. And then iodine is circulating throughout our blood. And then it is taken up into cells within the thyroid gland via a sodium iodine symporter. So this is something that's going to simultaneously transport sodium and iodine into the cell. And you know, this is, you know, a great example here. What do you think is driving that sodium gradient? Sodium, potassium, ATPase, right? All, you know, the sodium gradients are what are drivers of so many different sort of co-transports of ions and other molecules within transporter epithelia. So here we basically, we've pumped out sodium. Probably we've pumped out sodium from the cell. We have low levels of sodium inside the cell, high levels of sodium in the blood, and then we want to sort of concentrate iodine into the cell. What will we do? We'll have this importer here that uses the concentration difference of sodium to co-transport iodine. Okay, so then what happens? Okay, then we've got these other sort of pores that are just going to allow passive diffusion of this concentrated iodine into this sort of follicle colloid area. So this is an area where we basically have an encapsulated zone, okay, that's surrounded by these cells, these thyroid cells, that are going to dump out iodine into this little zone, okay? And there it's going to be combined with a protein that's produced from, through the transcription translation of mRNA into protein here, and then secreted into this colloid. Okay, so this protein is called thyroglobulin. Okay, it basically has a bunch of tyrosines on it, okay, that are next to each other. Okay, there's going to be an iodination step here. So enzymes are going to put iodine items at two locations on these tyrosines. And then there'll be a conjugation step, which then covalently links neighboring tyrosines together that are iodinated. Then this is going to get all cleaved up and then exocytosed as if they're completely iodinated thyroxine or partially iodinated triiodothyronine released into the blood. Okay, so you get about 10 times more T4 released than T3, but once you are inside the cells, that T4 is going to turn into T3 and be activated. Okay, so a key factor here is we have to have enough iodine in our diet. Otherwise, we can't make this, right? And where are we going to get that iodine from? You can get it from eggs. You can get it from seafood. Sea salt usually doesn't supply it. Okay. Many forms of salts many salt sort of deposits don't supply it. So if you ever see like the Morton salt can, or salt shaker, it usually says iodized salt on it. So addition of iodine to salt is a way that we generally get our dietary iodine, and sort of that discovery really, and the spread of iodized salt really sort of impacted it, reduced the prevalence of certain diseases like goiter in the population. So this is an example of goiter. It's a swelling of the thyroid gland. Okay. Why does it take place? It's because you don't have any iodine in your diet, or insufficient iodine in the diet. So when your cells here, the thyroid follicular cells, are producing all this protein, right? It's trying to go through this process. The thyroid follicles are swelling, okay? They're releasing this material, but it's not effective because it's not fully iodinated, okay? Because we don't have any iodine there. So there's not going to be negative feedback of the thyroid hormone on the hypothalamus or on the anterior pituitary. So we have high levels of TRH, high levels of TSH. TSH is going to keep telling the thyroid gland to continue to ramp up production of thyroid hormone, and that'll cause those tissues to swell. Okay, cause this neck to swell, and that's called goiter. Now, one of the ways that we can assess whether or not the thyroid is actually utilizing iodine effectively is through radiolabeling of iodine. Okay, so, many elements you can change the number of, in every element, right? An element is defined by the number of protons in its nucleus, okay? But you can sometimes change the number of neutrons within the nucleus, which can cause that element to become unstable and then split apart, fission at some point spontaneously, right? And so iodine 131 is one where the molecular weight of, or where the elements or the molecular weight of iodine is 131, and it's unstable. So you can substitute this radiolabeled version with regular iodine in the diet, okay, and then use a scan to see where radiation, gamma rays, are being emitted from the thyroid gland, right? So the iodine is going to get concentrated within the thyroid gland, and if iodine is getting effectively taken up by the thyroid, then this radio-labeled thing will show up. If it's not, then it won't show up. The concentration of iodine in the thyroid gland is also super important for things like in radiation safety. Does anybody ever see Chernobyl, or is that like before your time? Yeah, so that show, why do they take the iodine tablets? Okay, it's because one of the products, one of the most dangerous products, I guess, of a nuclear meltdown or a nuclear attack is this iodine 131 and other forms of radioactive iodine. So you want to actually block it from getting, and so a consequence in the Chernobyl meltdown was a huge increase in the prevalence of thyroid cancers. Okay? So in order to block that, you can overload your body system with massive amounts of non-radioactive iodine. Then the radioactive iodine can't really, sort of gets diluted. It can't, there's only a limited amount of iodine you can take in. So you sort of, pump your blood full of normal iodine. The radioactive iodine cannot get concentrated into the thyroid, and that protects you for the period of time that radioactive iodine is out in the atmosphere, which is, I can't remember, a couple weeks before it breaks down. Okay, that protects you from beta and gamma radiation coming from that iodine. Everyone should have their iodine, tablets at home in their emergency stockpile one day. Okay, so let's go back here. Okay, we talked about this, right? That's the hormone cascade pathway. Any questions at this point? Okay, so let's now turn towards calcium homeostasis. Okay, going back to PTH. Okay, so calcium is really, really, really important mineral in our body. Okay, and in fact, it's also the most abundant mineral in our body. We've got about 1 kilogram of calcium in our body. Where is it mostly? And it's in our bones. It's our skeleton. It is the formation. It provides the overall rigidity of our bodies, right, and our abilities to articulate movements, right, and the levels of blood calcium have to be maintained in actually quite narrow ranges. Okay, this is only like a 20% range here. Okay, too high is hypercalcemia, too low is hypocalcemia. And so we need and one of the reasons that we have to maintain that in a narrow range is that calcium is probably the most important second messenger signal within our bodies, okay, within our cells. The levels of calcium, free calcium inside your cytosol are around, on a normal cell, around 50 nanomolar, okay? Whereas our blood calcium levels are around 2 millimolar. Yeah. So that is like 100,000 times or 50,000 times more concentrated outside than on the inside. That makes it so that if calcium channels open within a cell, you'll get a flood of calcium into the cell, and that is a very high fidelity signal to the inside of the cell that something important just happened. So that is why calcium is an incredibly effective second messenger system, or initiator of second messenger systems. And we'll see this in the nervous system in a few lectures. So it's very important in regulating learning and memory. It's very important in control of heart rate, things like that. It also is going to affect protein configurations that are being involved in blood clotting and muscle contractions. It's going to come through voltage-gated sodium channels and that pass calcium as well. And so we have to really regulate this, okay? Now, how do we regulate it? Okay, we've got to have two different sort of pathways. We're going to have counteracting pathways, and we can do it really via regulating how much calcium we're taking up from our gut, how much we're excreting from our gut and our kidneys, as well as our internal reservoir of calcium, which is our bones, right? Like the actual amount of calcium that's deposited on our bones is, I don't know, probably 100 times more than the actual amount that's circulating throughout our blood. Okay, so we have to have, so for our fast regulation of calcium, that's going to be binding or unbinding calcium from the bones themselves. Okay, so let's look at here. So if we have blood calcium levels that are too low, calcium levels falling, the parathyroid gland will sense that, release parathyroid hormone. That's going to then go over to the osteoclasts, the cells of the bone that are designed to release calcium from the bones, okay, upregulate their activity, okay, and cause calcium to unbind from the bone. It's also going to increase calcium uptake in the kidneys, tubules. This is going to then, the kidneys themselves will produce vitamin D that also will take up increased calcium uptake within the intestines. Again, that's going to bring calcium levels back up. To counteract that, if we have too high calcium levels, the thyroid gland is going to release calcitonin. Calcitonin is going to cause the osteoblasts of the bones to take that calcium deposit onto the bones. It also is going to, that calcitonin will work on to reduce calcium uptake in the kidneys, and that'll bring us back into line. So if you have, you can get fragile bones, okay, and bone loss. Oftentimes it's a function of sort of postmenopausal women. It's very common to have osteoporosis, so a loss of bone density that can cause that, and that is going to be related to sex hormone signaling and the parathyroidism. Okay, so basically, if we have too much PTH in the system, in the body, we're going to release more calcium from the bones and cause the bones to sort of dissolve in a sense and make them, less strong. Okay, let's see, what's next? Okay, CRH and ACTH. Okay, so what is CRH? This is corticotropin releasing hormone, which is then going to be released from our hypothalamus. It's going to act on anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay, that is then going to travel through the blood, land on our adrenal cortex. Okay, that adrenal cortex has a set of sort of layers within it that are going to release a variety of different hormones called corticosteroids that will then regulate digestion, the immune system, mood, sexuality, energy storage, energy expenditure, a whole bunch of different things, mineral uptake, okay, stress. So, and those are in turn going to have negative feedback on the corticotropin releasing hormone and the adrenocorticotropic hormone here. Okay, so what releases adrenocorticotropic hormone? The corticotropes in the anterior pituitary. Where are these acting? Where's ACTH acting? It's acting on the adrenal gland. Now, we've talked a little bit about the adrenal gland already. Okay, this is this gland, this sort of pyramid of tissue that sits on top of each kidney. Okay, and some of the things that it releases are directly impacting the kidney. So the top, you can sort of divide it into 4 layers. The top 3 layers are part of the cortex. And then we have the medulla, the inside sort of layer here. And each layer here is going to have a specific function. So the outermost layer is going to release mineralocorticoids, the most important one of which, the only one you need to know, is aldosterone, okay, which is going to, again, increase sodium and water reabsorption. That will tend to increase our blood volume and blood pressure. Then in the middle, we've got glucocorticoids. This is the primary one that is important there is cortisol. Release cortisol. That's going to cause an increase in blood glucose levels. It's going to suppress your immune system. It's an anti-inflammatory. It's basically a stress response. And that will tend to break down muscle. And then finally, we have the sex steroids. So in men, these are androgens. In women, they're estrogens and progestins. So there's two major areas where you're going to get sex hormone production in the body. You have the gonads, so testes and ovaries. And then as a secondary place where these things are formed is this sort of lower level of the cortex of the adrenal gland. So after menopause, or if there's like a castration event in men, right, that is going to be the only source of those sex hormones. And so even though the primary area of sex hormone production is gonads, you will still be able to have some sex steroids after menopause. Okay, so all of these, okay, are steroid hormones. Okay, or so these are all sort of lipophilic hormones. Okay. Now, and all of these are under control of hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary or the kidney. Now, this is sort of stuff that's going to operate on slow time scales. Okay, if we want to sort of change body's composition or what's inside the body over slower time scales, you're going to use stuff in the cortex of the adrenal gland. But we also have this area down here in the medulla, okay, which produces epinephrine. Okay, so epinephrine is the driver of our fight or flight response, or the body's coordination of a fight or flight response. We've talked about it a lot already, right? And within the chromaffin cells of the medulla, they are producing adrenaline, epinephrine. Also, they produce noradrenaline or norepinephrine. Same thing. And these are under electrical control. So coming down from the spinal cord, part of the sympathetic nervous system, you're going to have branches off of the thoracic part of the spinal cord that are going to innervate or make electrical connections onto the medulla. Okay. And upon triggering electrical activity in that pathway, you can get a very fast release of epinephrine. So you see something that scares you. You ever feel like maybe you're in a car and you know somebody about to hit you, right? You're suddenly shocked, right? You have this surge of tingling sensation throughout your body. That is the rapid release of epinephrine or adrenaline from the medulla that's actually causing that sort of perceptual tactile response. Okay. Yeah. Okay, any questions about this?
So are we gonna need to know like the name and what what hormone it releases for the test, or are we just gonna need to know the hormone?
I think you should at least know if it's coming from the cortex or the medulla. I don't think you need to know glomerulosa fasciculata or whatever. That stuff, that's a little bit too high level here, but too level. But yeah, you should know origin, how it's controlled, right? Is it under hormonal control, hormonal release? Is it slow versus fast release? Is it under electrical control? And then what it's going to target, right? Okay, let's see here. So what are some of the things that sex steroids do, right? So testosterone is, used to produce masculizing the sex characteristics. So our gonads, right, are going to produce most of the sex hormones. So we can characterize these into androgens, okay, so male promoting, and estrogens or progestins, which are sort of female associated characteristics. So all three of those sex hormones are produced in male and female, but in very different proportions. Okay, so the testes are going to synthesize androgens, which is mostly testosterone, and that's going to stimulate the development and maintenance of the male reproductive system. And then it's going to cause an increase in muscle and bone mass. You can take it as or synthetic derivatives to, dramatically increase, completely reshape how the body's composition. And they are also going to be the androgen production is actually going to be the determining factor into whether a fetus develops male sex organs or not. Okay, so you're sort of in a sense you're sort of born undifferentiated, and in the absence of male sex hormones, you will develop into female sex organ characteristics with the sort of turning on of the SHY gene, production of testosterone, you'll start developing male sex characteristics. So these hormones spike during puberty and adolescence and are going to cause the growth of hair, lowering of voice, increased muscle mass and bone density. So then we have some estrogens. Okay, so estrogens there's really 3 types of estrogens. We can just call them estrogen though, for the purpose of this course. Most importantly, it's estrogen, and estradiol is like the primary estrogen. And they're going to be involved in the maintenance of the female reproductive system, development of female secondary sex characteristics, like growth of breasts, things like that. So we've got also progestins, which include progesterone, and they are going to prepare and maintain the uterus for pregnancy. And so there's different sorts of birth control pills that are going to use patterns of progestin or estrogen to sort of trick the body into thinking that they're potentially pregnant, okay? That will suppress ovulation, thicken cervical mucus, and prevent sperm from entering the uterus and prevent any implantation prevent any ovulation to occur. So these sex hormones are going to be controlled by follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which we'll talk about in the next week. All right. So now looking back down at the adrenal medulla. Okay, this is actually a pretty good diagram, right? We have adrenal cortex. This is a sort of nice little summary here, right? I should probably move this slide a little bit forward, right? So we've got sort of the slower responses here on the adrenal cortex, our mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, sex hormones on the adrenal cortex, controlled by hormone release of anterior pituitary. And then we have the electrical stimulation of the adrenal medulla that releases epinephrine and norepinephrine that does the fight or flight. Okay. Slide is this 46. Okay. Okay. Now, what about growth? Okay, so the body's growth of tissues is going to be driven by growth hormone. Growth hormone secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, which is promoted by somatotropin, releasing hormone or growth hormone releasing hormone, also known as somatotropin, up in the hypothalamus. And it's going to promote growth directly on body's tissues. And it's also going to promote it through the development or the production of insulin-like growth factors from the liver. So growth hormone going to travel to the liver, turn on IGF-1. That's then going to circulate through the blood and cause bone and cartilage growth. If you don't have growth hormone when you are during development, your skeleton will stop growing. Okay. And so one of the sort of treatments for people that have, if a child is tracking really low on the scale, under 5% of the general typical growth curves, then sometimes those children will be treated with growth hormone in order to stimulate their growth, in order to bring them up into sort of a more normal range. Now, if you have too much growth hormone, you can have gigantism. So gigantism during development is too much growth hormone during development. You might turn into a giant, be really tall. If you have too much growth hormone after you're an adult, you develop what's known as acromegaly. So after you're finished with puberty and adolescence and your body normally stops growing, the growth plates of the bones grow dormant. You can no longer lengthen the bones, but you still can sort of grow the thickening of the bones and cartilage, right? If growth hormone continues to be high. So there's something called acromegaly. The hands get really thick. The bones of the hands get really thick. The skull gets thickened. And basically all of the bone structures get sort of thicker, although not getting any longer. And this is actually looks like there's potentially like that's also a potential consequence of usage of human growth hormone, recombinant human growth hormone in athletics. Sometimes people have, so they could tell whether or not a baseball player was was on growth hormone because their hat size keeps getting bigger and bigger over time. Barry Bonds to be an example there. Now, so how might we get too much growth hormone? Okay, this could be often caused by adenomas. So that would be a cancer of the anterior pituitary gland that then causes too much release of growth hormone. Okay, and so oftentimes you'll see, maybe you'll see and that can continue to. So really the tallest people that have ever lived generally had adenomas. Okay. Now you still can genetically have extremely tall people. Yao Ming was like 7'6", had very, very tall parents, right? So there are genetic components to that, but the very tallest people, once you're getting above like 7'6", almost everybody above 7'6" pretty much has some tumor within their anterior pituitary or some dysregulation of the hypothalamus. Okay, so here's the pathway. So we have our growth hormone releasing hormone of the hypothalamus. So there's two sets of cells in the hypothalamus, growth hormone releasing hormone cells and somatostatin releasing cells. Okay, those two molecules, the balance of those two molecules are going to target these somatotropes within the anterior pituitary. Okay, and then those somatotropes will release growth hormone, which has both direct effects on the bones, cartilage growth, and the metabolism of the body, as well as promoting IGF release from the liver. There's going to be negative feedback at multiple stages here, both on the hypothalamus and on the somatotropes themselves. Okay. The pineal gland. Okay, so we haven't talked about that one this much. Pineal gland is a tiny little structure back here that sits underneath the thalamus, okay? And it sort of releases a molecule called melatonin. Probably heard of melatonin. Melatonin is often used as and I think it's not that effective. Orally active melatonin doesn't seem to be that effective, but it's often used by people to try to, get better sleep. Okay, because melatonin levels fluctuate, higher melatonin throughout the day, and play a role in regulating sleep initiation and maintenance. So this melatonin is really just a modified amino acid, and the duration of the night sort of impacts how much melatonin is released and how long melatonin is released. So how does that actually work? So if we look here, we have a structure here called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Okay, suprachiasmatic nucleus is it's basically a pathway through which certain information from the retina passes on its way to the back of the brain where visual information is actually processed. Okay, the back of the cerebral cortex. So the retina's got a couple different sort of sensors for light. It's got like red light photo detectors, green light photo detectors, blue light photo detectors. Okay, and those are all merged together to sort of create a color vision. But there is also like a collateral output of the blue light photoreceptors specifically, okay, that goes to the suprachiasmatic nucleus and provides feedback as to what is the overall level of light that's happening during the day. Okay, so our bodies have intrinsic rhythms that cause the upregulation and downregulation of various genes throughout the day on about a 25-hour cycle. If you take humans and put them in a cave or put them in a bunker, this has been first was done in like this mammoth cave study back in the 30s, and then more carefully in the 60s, and they just put them where you can control your own life cycle, okay, but you have no knowledge of what the outside world is like. Okay, the circadian rhythm of those people tends to be every 25 hours they'll go through this fluctuation. So you'll get some sort of drift over time. What the activity of the suprachiasmatic nucleus does and its impact on the pineal gland is it takes the light and the overall light cycles of the day and then modifies the output of the pineal gland so that we entrain our circadian rhythm to a 24-hour light cycle. Now, This is specifically blue light that impacts the activity of the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So over the last, as that has become sort of more appreciated, we've seen things like, night mode on your phone or your devices, right? Where it turns off the blue color on your screen, okay, at night, so that you can try to continue work without disrupting your overall circadian rhythm as much, right? Obviously, staring at a bright computer screen, trying to study for something at midnight, it's not good for your circadian rhythm because you are entraining your system into a non-24-hour cycle. Okay. Of course, if you want to stay up late, no matter what, like, okay, keep the blue light on. But if you want to try to get to bed and try not to disrupt your cycle as much, you can just try to completely eliminate the blue light to prevent your cycle from being as disrupted. Okay, and then finally, we've got melanocyte stimulating hormone. Okay, so melanocytes are cells that are throughout our skin, and they create granules of pigments that basically absorb light. Okay, so it doesn't matter what your skin color really is. You have the same number of melanocytes, which are the cells within your body. Okay. However, the activity of those melanocytes can vary based on the level of melanocyte stimulating hormones that are in your blood, and then that was going to impact how many of these granules are produced by each melanocyte and how dark your skin is. So this is it also can melanocyte stimulating hormone, like, so in humans, right, we typically have one particular sort of pigment color that can then be adjusted through feedback from, UV light, cause skin to darken through regulation of MSH. Okay. Now that in amphibians, so there are also like some amphibians that can change the color of their skin more dramatically, and that can also be regulated through direct release of MSH. And what we can see here is that does not actually increase the number of granules, but it can cause a dispersion of the granules to change that color in a much more dynamic way. So in this case, and that is something that happens via membrane-bound receptors on those melanocytes. We can tell that because if we inject melanocyte stimulating hormone inside a cell directly, there's no effect. And if you inject melanocyte stimulating hormone into the interstitial fluid surrounding a cell, it will bind on the receptors, cause a second messenger cascade, and then cause dispersion. Okay, so that will then lead to a rapid darkening of the skin. That does not, yeah, go ahead.
Like, in terms of melanocytes, aren't they supposed to be like the granules are supposed to as a defense mechanism for your skin against like to be able to absorb these?
Sure, right. It's like, why do we have darker skin? It's a defense mechanism to absorb UV light and prevent DNA damage, essentially. Yeah. Okay, so then, so MSH levels go up during pregnancy, and this can lead to miasma, which is a darkening of the skin. Typically, that's going to happen on like the nipples, on the skin, sometimes on the face and blotches. And really interestingly, it can happen at the midline of the body. Okay, so you get a dark line down the body, which is really like the point of fusion between the two halves of your body. Okay, so it can reveal these like, sort of the history of the development of your body through the darkening of the skin. And then, after birth, this can persist for months at a time. Okay, that's the darkening of the skin during, in response to a changing of MSH. Okay, so that's all the content for endocrine system. If there's any questions, I'm happy to address them. I will do a cram session for the test on Zoom at noon to 1. I'm going to do it in my office. If you want to come by the office in Head Code 228, you're also welcome to come and do it in person there to join in. We'll see how many people come. Maybe we'll have to move it, but it will be on Zoom. So 12 to 1, and it'll be recorded. Yeah.
The only thing that we need to know, like you mentioned, that we can help it's not like it's really the delivery of this next switch and all the ones that are like explicit next to the price, right?
Mhm.